Let's take a look at stories across the continent this past week that have made headlines and some stories that maybe you should also be aware of. New banknotes and coins have finally hit the streets of Zimbabwe after a false start. And if the country's economic woes weren't enough, the nation is also experiencing its worst drought in years. Rangers say hundreds of animals in its national park have died from a severe drought. In South Sudan, President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar have postponed the formation of a power-sharing government by 100 days. Meanwhile, Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo have signed an agreement to increase trade and investment. And can a special status bring peace to Cameroon's Anglophone region? We have Analyst Ayesha Kajee, who joins us in studio now. As always, a pleasure to have you, Ayesha.
Thank you, Vic.
All right, let's start in Zimbabwe. Obviously, new banknotes. This is part of President Emmerson Mnangagwa's monetary reforms. What are some of the changes to the new notes?
Well, they are quite similar to the Zimbabwean bond notes that were issued in 2016. So in appearance, the notes look quite similar. But Zimbabweans themselves are not convinced that they'll help to end hyperinflation in the country. Currently, inflation is around 380%,
yes,
higher even than during the last crash in 2008. So this attempt to bring in new Zimbabwean notes into into circulation and coins into circulation is an attempt to reverse that hyperinflation a bit.
And they've done it before and it hasn't worked. I mean,
yes,
they have printed notes before. It hasn't brought down inflation. In fact, it's probably made matters worse for them. And obviously, this is not, like you said, the cash cannot resolve any of the economic problems.
No, because that cash is not actually based on real solid reserves within the country.
Right.
And the Zimbabwean people know this. So, for example, what it will do is it might exacerbate what's happening on the black market already.
Yes.
In the sense that many traders will discount goods by 40% if you pay cash for them.
Because they all want cash.
That's right, as opposed to paying by EcoBank or card or other means.
And I see there's also a cash withdrawal limit of $20, which I'm assuming in Zimbabwe right now, $20
Yes,
doesn't get you very far.
$5 barely buys you a bottle of soft drink.
Yes.
So, you know, and then the new dollar notes are in $2 and $5 denominations. If they had been perhaps in $50 and $100 notes, they might have gained some currency. But at this low level, really, it's a kind of, you know, using a Band-Aid to try and plug a gaping wound,
I mean,
really.
Do you think that these monetary reforms now and the addition of this cash into the reserves, is it angering Zimbabweans even more? Is it making them more frustrated?
I think it is frustrating them. I think Zimbabweans are slow to anger, which is why they have actually endured a great deal over the last few decades,
yes,
both economically and politically. But I think it's very, very frustrating for them when they are queuing up to get money and they're unable to withdraw more than $20, when they're trying to use that currency in circulation but have so little that their buying power is severely limited. So, you know, it's as I said, it's the wrong solution, in my view, to what is a huge problem. And it needs a turnaround of macroeconomic policy before anything can really be resolved in Zimbabwe.
I mean, do we know just exactly how much cash they plan on injecting into the economy?
They have said that over $1 billion in the next couple of years. One wonders, I'm presuming that's US dollars, but one wonders, you know, whether that will actually come to fruition or not. As you know, there was a delay on Monday and Tuesday in actually issuing the new currency as well, which also led to speculation as to what the Reserve Bank was doing and why it was delaying, etc.
I mean, okay, while we're in Zimbabwe, and like we're saying, you know, if the economic issues wasn't enough, I mean, they now have a problem of drought, and they're saying that, I mean, obviously, yes, they do get a hot and dry season. It is that time of year, but this time of year, they've never seen it as hot and as dry as it is right now. I mean, you look at some of these heartbreaking visuals of elephants that have, you know, and animals in these parks that are fighting for resources that are scarce, water and food to survive. I mean, and they're also now planning, rangers are apparently planning a massive migration of these animals to the northern parts of the country. What do we know about this? I mean, I know that these parks are also owned by immense pressure. So how are these parks managing to control the situation?
Well, I think they've managed thus far because Zimbabwe does have some very, very dedicated conservation people, rangers amongst them, people who work within the national park system, and they've been doing their utmost. But if you go, for example, onto Google Earth and you look at this part of the world on a live satellite map, you can see just how dry Southern Africa as a whole is, and Zimbabwe as a whole. If you look, for example, at pictures of Victoria Falls compared to previous years at this time of the year, again, you can see that the falls are depleted. So there is a huge drought problem. Zimbabwe has not made contingency plans for, a water shortage. And, of course, the first casualties of that are going to be the vegetation and then the animals that depend on that vegetation, and eventually the humans as well, of course.
And it's unfortunate because now African governments need to take climate change a lot more seriously than we have been doing.
Absolutely, which they have not been doing at all seriously over the past few decades, unfortunately. Besides which, the animals and the national parks in Zimbabwe are a money spinner for the government, and they should be cognizant of that. They provide jobs, but they also bring tourism into the country.
All right. Let's look at South Sudan. We see also this week the unity government was again delayed. This time they have an extension by 100 days. Do we know the reasons behind this delay?
The reasons behind the delay, frankly, are largely because there hasn't been the military integration that was promised, and the funding for that military integration, for integrating the rebels of Riek Machar's forces into the Sudanese army, that funding hasn't been forthcoming in its entirety. It's been coming in dribs and drabs, and there has been no real political will on the part of President Salva Kiir's government to integrate Mr. Machar's troops into the army. That's one. The second reason, of course, is that Mr. Kiir, after Mr. Machar was fired from government, actually divided the 10 states of Southern Sudan into 28. And the rebels...
That was a contentious issue as well.
Very contentious. They see this as an attempt to divide and rule.
I mean, there have been many delays. Yes. So I don't think we are surprised that this is another delay. But I mean, they're also saying they haven't even laid out any consequences if there could be another delay. And chances are there possibly could be another delay.
Well, if this delay is going to take us until about February, to about February this next year, February 2020, and already, you've got about 400,000 Southern Sudanese refugees in Sudan, in the Republic of Sudan, and other neighboring countries, who have been displaced by this ongoing civil conflict between Mr. Machar's forces and Mr. Kiir's, of course.
Salva Kiir, yes.
And one of the underlying issues is ethnicity, but it is not the main issue in South Sudan. The main issue is really the distribution of resources. And the major resource at the moment in the country is the oil. And so the distribution of resources from the oil profits is what really needs to come to the fore. So the security situation is important, and it is at the forefront at the moment, but the underlying reason is the resource issue.
It's interesting that you mentioned the ethnicities. A little bit later, we're going to be chatting immigration, colonization, and some of the legacies of colonization, particularly how that's influenced ethnic violence on the continent as well. I mean, we see it happen all the time. We see Hutu rebels currently fighting, so we're going to unpack that issue. But while we're just talking to Ayesha, let's also maybe move on to Cameroon. We see that the president has, I wouldn't know, would I say that this is extending an olive branch to the English-speaking people of Cameroon? I mean, there seems to be a lot of conflict happening in Cameroon regarding Francophone and Anglophone-speaking people. Where the Anglophone people feel they're being encroached, the Francophone culture is being encroached on them.
There's an attempt to forcibly assimilate them into the sort of majority Francophone culture. And this has been, again, an ongoing thing. The Anglophone part of the country is about 20 to 25% of the entire region. But it is very, very different, not just linguistically, but culturally from Francophone Cameroon.
When we say special status, are we saying special status that we know it to be Hong Kong special status? Canada's got special, well, Quebec. This is what it could work out to be?
It could work out to be some form of federalism in the works. Although, having said that, whether Mr. Biya's commitment to this is genuine or not should also be something we should be looking at. He's been in power for 37 years. Is he really going to do something to placate the Anglophone part of the country after all these years?
I mean, what sort of power would the president have if special status would be granted to the Anglophone part of Congo?
It would depend on, as I said, some kind of federal agreement where certain responsibilities of government are devolved to the federal level. For example, education, issues of culture and language in government, in business, etc. I think those would be huge issues, and religion as well, would be huge issues for the northwest and southwest parts of Cameroon, which are the parts that Mr. Biya is talking about allocating or according special status to.
All right, let's also look at one more before we let you go, Ayesha. Being proposed, I mean, business and, trading between Uganda and the DRC. Obviously, Uganda now taking advantage of opportunities with the DRC because that border being closed with Rwanda.
Look, there is currently a balance of trade between Uganda and the DRC, which is currently, about 500 million US dollars, which is currently in Uganda's favor largely. Only about 30 million of that is exports from Congo.
Which is why I'm not surprised that they're now going to Congo because of that border being closed with Rwanda.
Absolutely.
It's quite strategic.
It opens up a potential market of millions of Congolese people for Uganda, and a relatively smaller market for Congolese goods into Uganda. But if you look at what is happening in parts of the DRC at the moment, the major markets would be for building materials, etc., school supplies and school equipment, etc., would be quite a big one. The Ugandan foreign minister has said something about Uganda being able to produce, one Ugandan company being able to produce, for example, about 10,000 blankets per year. But there only being a market for about 3,000 because Uganda's got a relatively small population. So those kinds of goods could also see cross-border traffic. But the main challenge to that, of course, is security. There are armed militia groups in the eastern part of the DRC which will pose a security threat to any road traffic in the region. So both countries are going to have to come to some agreement on how they're going to ensure security of goods crossing through that corridor.
All right, there you have it. Ayesha Kajee, our analyst, joining us in studio, unpacking some of the biggest stories happening on the continent from this past week. Speaking of the continent, we look at the scramble for Africa. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. The Berlin Conference, all the way back in 1884. We're going to have some experts in studio. There's a professor who is going to shed some insight into Africa particularly, and how the borders have still been influenced by colonialism still today. News will continue after a short break.